Welcome back to this week's episode on Happiness Happens. I'm Simona, and today we have a conversation that is going to blow your mind because we are talking all about stress. We're talking about the dopamine hit, and we are talking all things happiness with my guest, Mark Congdon. Mark and I had just such an incredible conversation when it comes to happiness, when it comes to stress, when it comes to dopamine, to try and understand the ways in which it impacts our lives and why it is that we continue to go over and over and over again into these same patterns. Before we get into my conversation with Mark, let me tell you a little bit about him. He is the Forbes Books author of The Ideal Life: 7 Steps to Harness Your Stress, Discover Your Purpose, and Achieve Your Goals. He's also the founder and CEO of Into the Ideal, an organization helping individuals find their purpose, their joy, and the career they deserve. He has earned a master's in industrial organizational psychology from the Harvard Extension School and spent 10 years leading operations, sales, and strategic leadership in the transportation logistics industry. If you love what you hear today, I would be so grateful if you could leave a 5-star review. Tell us how much you loved our conversation, what you gained from it. This helps us reach more listeners and get into the ears of people who need to hear this message. So with that, let's get into our conversation. Mark, welcome to Happiness Happens. I'm so excited to have you on the show today.
I am really excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. We're going to have such a great conversation today. We're talking about dopamine. We're talking about stress. But first, before we dive into any of those specifics, I want to know what happiness means to you.
Yeah, it's a great question because happiness is such a loaded word. It's
Uh-huh.
like first everybody feels like they just want to be happy, right? Like how can I be happy?
Yeah.
And that actually goes back to the earliest civilization in the earliest writings with the early philosophers. Aristotle was the first one to say what the purpose of life is, at least from what we can see in recorded history. And what he said was the purpose of life is to be happy, or
Hmm.
at least that's what people think that he said. He actually used the word eudaimonia, which is better translated as well-being. And he didn't really mean that you should just feel pleasure all the time or just feel comfortable all the time. What he meant was life is meant to be enjoyed, to feel joyful, but that also includes sometimes hard work
Hmm.
and deliberate practice and things like that. So I resonate more with that. So when I think about happiness, I think about a word that has become loaded to mean just feeling good and feeling pleasurable all the time and just chasing that. But to me, happiness is finding the right balance between the pleasure and the pain in the pursuit of a meaningful life. And to me, that creates joy. And so to me, I'd rather define what joy is, which
Hmm.
is pushing yourself and embracing the pain involved with becoming a better version of yourself and doing that consistently, understanding that that is a lifelong struggle.
That is such a cool answer. I love that you went there. And I love that you brought that little piece of history into the show because I think that's a really cool perspective to have. Because I think a lot of the times people get overwhelmed when they think about happiness, that everything needs to be perfect all the time. You know, that we have no stress and we have no worry and no fear and no shame and no guilt, when that's not necessarily the case, right? When all of those things can coexist together. But when we're looking for, striving for a happy life, all of those things are allowed to coexist together and it
Mhm.
creates what we have in our life. But I think a lot of it is to do with perspective.
Yeah. And not just that those things can coincide together, like the happiness and the struggle, but if you were actually going to choose one or the other, you might actually be better off choosing the struggle.
Hmm.
Viktor Frankl wrote Man's Search for Meaning. It's an amazingly impactful short read, but so much packed into it about his experience during the Holocaust and his
Hmm.
family, him being separated from his family in the internment camps. And what he found was the thing that kept him going and allowed him to survive was the purpose that he felt in writing this book about this very topic that he wanted to make sure he completed. And so he just focused on thinking about that book and being able to rewrite it while he was in camp. And that purpose actually allowed him to make it through. And
Hmm.
what he found was, as he looked at the other prisoners in the camp with him, he found that the ones who could see some form of meaning in their life and some form of purpose had better experiences physically, like they were
Hmm.
less likely to die while they were in camp, they were more likely to make it through, and they were more likely to be able to manage their situation. And what he said is that struggle and pain is the best way to bring the meaning out in your life.
Mm-hmm.
And meaning is the most important thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so if we're just happy all the time, we're not forced to contemplate like why we're here, answer those hard questions. But if we're really put into the thick of it, that's the first question that comes to mind. It's like, why am I even doing this? What's it for?
Mm-hmm.
And true joy actually comes from having that purpose. And so ideally, we're able to balance out the struggle and the pain in our life with the happiness. But if we were to choose one or the other, it's actually more likely to feel true joy by having the struggle.
I really agree with you. And Mark, I want to ask you, why do you think that some people just cannot access this within them? You know, I look at it as sort of like there's sort of two schools of thought, in my opinion. You can either look at a really hard situation and tap into that and make it into something that's more purposeful in your life, or you get all consumed by it and you get swallowed up by it like forever and you're not able to see the good. What is the differentiating factor, in your opinion, between the two of those?
I think it all comes down to control. So
Hmm.
psychologists have found that you can really look at a lot of personality traits through the lens of if you have an external locus of control
Mm-hmm.
or an internal locus of control. In other words, do you look at life and say that, hey, this is happening to me,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's the struggle or the happiness? I got lucky, and that's why these good things are happening. Or there's nothing I can do, and that's why these bad things are happening. Or do you have an internal locus of control saying, hey, regardless of my situation, I can impact how to experience happiness or how to deal with my challenges? And what they found is that things like optimism and results, both physiological, like how well people's health is, and also how likely they are to achieve their goals, is tied to having the internal locus of control, where things like pessimism and negativity, and also negative health outcomes
Mm-hmm.
and less likely to achieve goals, is associated with external.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to look at whatever your situation is and saying, these are the things that I can control despite the noise, despite the other things,
Mm-hmm.
that I think is what allows people to tap into the happiness. Like, for
Mm-hmm.
example, my mom, she was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. And by the time they found it, it had already grown through her sternum. It had pierced her lung.
Oh,
Fluid was filling so
wow.
she couldn't breathe. It had grown into her skull, into her femur, it was everywhere. And the doctors said, you have 3 months to live at max. You need to keep a journal, say goodbye to your grandchildren. Obviously,
Wow.
that devastated me. But what inspired me so much is she said, okay, she had her moment to grieve the diagnosis. But then she said, all right, so I've got 3 months to live. That's what's been told to me. What can I control in those 3 months to make sure that my remaining time is as joyful as it can be?
Mm-hmm.
And so she used a lot of the concepts that I write about in my book, The Ideal Life, and I tell her story there too, to say, okay, well, it was easier for her at that point to say, what kind of person do I want to be at the end of my life? Because it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
very far away. And then she said, well, what can I control? So she researched that cancer can only eat carbohydrate and sugars. So she said, okay, well, I'm going to get rid of that in my diet. So she switched to a keto diet, which was hard for her, even though
Yeah.
she thought that was the right thing to do for cancer. It still took her weeks to get to that point.
Yep.
But she my Fitness Pal app, she tracked all of her calories, even though she didn't even want to do that. And she got to the point where it became a habit and she limited her carbs. She adopted things like mindfulness to deal with her stress. And she started taking the medicine that the doctors gave her.
Mm-hmm.
And that was 4 years ago. She's still alive. The
No.
doc, yeah, it's amazing. And the doctors said, even with the medicine that we gave you, they did a documentary about her and they made a whole little movie about her that they showed to their patients, because
Oh
they
my
said this is a
goodness.
miracle. It should not have worked that well. And they, I think that it's obvious that the way that we frame the control we have in our life and the
Mm-hmm.
way that we intentionally set our mindset around the goals that we're setting and around the intention behind that has a clear impact on the chemicals that are released in our brain, the amount of cortisol that's released, and the amount of positive chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin,
Mm-hmm.
serotonin, endorphins. When you have an unintentional and external locus of control, you allow that chemical cocktail just to be whatever your environment says it's going to be. And if that means that there's a lot of stress in your life, Well, that means you're going to have a lot of cortisol, which means
Mm-hmm.
inflammation and disease and negative outlooks. But if you take more control, you can have a better aligned environment that, one, for a normal circumstance, lets you face the day with more joy, more intentionality. But
Mm-hmm.
also sometimes when you're facing disease, it creates a better internal environment for medicine to do its job.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one thing that really convinced me to leave my career in the logistics industry and to start the ideal life, was the realization that there are real biological, psychological things that we can control. They're
Mm-hmm.
not as complicated as we think. And if we can make just a little bit of an impact there, it can have a really big result.
That's super powerful. So I have two thoughts that immediately come to mind with this. When we use the word control, I think a lot of the times what we're looking for in life is control over something, right? Which is
Mm,
why we get put into these cycles. And they can be negative spirals or they can also be positive ones, right? Like in the case of your mom, she took this diagnosis and turned it into a positive into her life. But a lot of people might take that and turn that into a negative in their life, right? Try and take that control and latch onto things in a negative way. So, how much would you say does stress and the need for control contribute to this overall dopamine trap that we're constantly finding ourselves in?
Well, that need for control. So we all do have a need for control, and that
Mm-hmm.
dates all the way back to our caveman days, where
Yeah.
if we didn't know how to control our immediate environment, we were at the mercy of the weather, whether that was, the cold or the heat or the rain or whatever. And we were also at the mercy of predators and other tribes that might attack us. So if we couldn't control our ability to deal with that, that meant we weren't going to survive.
Hmm.
And so as we evolved with a deep, deep need to control our immediate environment. Now, today's modern society looks way different. We don't have the same type of physical threat that we constantly did back then, but our biology is the same, which means
Mm-hmm.
we still have that need for control. But how are we filling that need? Are we filling the need by looking at controlling other people, controlling the external things around us? Or are we looking at how we can control our own internal actions, our own thoughts, our own responses to our environment?
Mm-hmm.
When we try to control the external things, that's just another way of giving away control, actually,
Right.
because we can't control things that are
Right.
outside of us. We can influence them, but the way we influence them begins with controlling who we are inside. So I think the key to control is not by saying, I'm going to control my partner, or I'm going to control my colleagues, or I'm going to control this or that. It's by saying, okay, I woke up this morning. Here's what I have on my plate. Now, what can I do to better
Mm-hmm.
control my day?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where you can influence your environment in a much more effective way.
Beautiful. I love that. And I think that's a really good distinction too, because I think a lot of the times it's easy to get stuck into this cycle and it can be hard to get off of that cycle when you're on it because, you know, we search for negativity first. It's the easiest thing for us to latch on to, right? It's easier to look at things through a negative lens, right?
Mm-hmm.
We default to that. And so when you I even consider like myself like a pretty positive, upbeat person, but I can even still find myself like it's easier for me to latch on to the things that are more negative because it's more comfortable, right? And I think this also goes back into this dopamine trap. Like we get stuck in it. Like how is it that we get stuck in it, and why is it that we get stuck in it? And I think even further than that, what is the effect of being in a dopamine trap? What is the effect that it has on our nervous system? Like how is that impacting us on a mind, body, soul level?
Well, so there's kind of two different things when I hear you ask that question.
Hmm.
One is I hear you say, it's easy to get stuck in the negative thoughts, and it is.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is that the way to break through the easiness of falling into the negative thought pattern is actually, in a lot of ways, to actually increase the amount of stress that you have rather than get rid of it. And now
Okay.
that seems like a paradox, right? Or like
Tell
a
me more.
contradiction. So psychology actually is not that old of a science. Psychology was formed in the mid 1800s, and it was formed by combining biology with philosophy. And so it took the study of the human body and applied it to those ancient questions like Aristotle asked, why are we here? One of the first questions that psychology asked was, what is stress and how do we deal with it? So
Mhm.
these two psychologists, Yerkes and Dodson, studied this, and they developed, or they had this finding that has been so consistent that it's considered a law. It's called the Yerkes-Dodson law. And what they found is that people who don't have enough stress in their life as they pursue goals have very low performance.
Mm.
And the reason for that is you don't even want to get off the couch. You're just happy, you're pleasurable, but that is experienced as boredom, which actually feels distressful to us. It feels stressful, and it doesn't feel good. Now, on the flip side, if you have too much stress, that also decreases performance because you're overwhelmed. You
Mhm.
can't focus on what you need to focus on to be successful in what you're doing. So success goes down there too, and that also feels distressful. It feels bad, and that feels like burnout. So there's boredom on one side, burnout on the other. What they found was in the middle of that, they called it the optimal zone of arousal, or the optimum amount of stress. And to differentiate that stress from the boredom and the burnout, they called it eustress with the prefix
Mm.
EUSTRESS. EU is a Greek prefix meaning good, where dis is a prefix meaning bad. So it's the
Mhm.
good stress. And so if you are trying too hard and you're feeling stressed, that's one thing. But to your point, if it's just easy and comfortable to get stuck in that trap, the best thing you can do is identify some tangible goal and then add stress to your life. Like say, hey, I need to push myself out of my comfort zone to pursue it. And what that does is that breaks through the negative cycle. It moves you from the boredom of dealing with your negativity into the intentionality of pursuing a goal. All of a sudden, everything starts to get a little bit better.
It's
So
so it's so much as you're saying this, I'm thinking to myself back when I was in college, like I'm very deadline driven, you know? And it's not that
yeah,
I can't motivate myself throughout the day because I totally can and during the week and all that kind of stuff. But if I know that something needs to get done, it's like this switch goes and it's like, okay, let's just do this thing. And I think it's like a good kind of stress to have because it
yeah.
does push you in some way. But then also on the flip side of that can contribute to some additional stress that you might not want in your life. The stress of this thing is on my mind and I've got to get this done and you know what I mean? But it's not the time right now, you know?
Well, and also that can lead to burnout if you push yourself too hard. But
Mm-hmm.
also what you just said points me back to the second question that you had about the dopamine trap and how you can get stuck in it and what's going on
Mm-hmm.
at the neurological level.
Mm-hmm.
So the first step is intentionally pursuing your goals and pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone, and that's a good thing. There's actually a risk, though, to being too good at that and achieving your
Mm-hmm.
goals and hitting your deadlines. Because what happens when you achieve your goals is you do get that extra burst of dopamine for the actual achievement of the goal. But
Yep.
you also get other things like goals related to fitting in
Mm-hmm.
with our tribe, with our group, leads to
Mm-hmm.
oxytocin. We also have goals related to standing out and getting respect from the tribe, which is kind of a combating
Mm-hmm.
result
Like a
there. And
paradox,
that gives
yeah.
you serotonin. And then as you push yourself out of your comfort zone, you get endorphins, which are given as you get stress from the cortisol. So we have this whole chemical cocktail. So I refer to those good feeling chemicals as the dose chemicals,
Mm-hmm.
dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins. But you need the cortisol too, the stress, right? So you have this chemical cocktail. Those rewards feel really good, but when we put too much emphasis on goal achievement, we get addicted to those rewards. There's a very interesting study on this done by B.F. Skinner
Mm-hmm.
about 60, 70 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Again, with results so consistent that they're still useful today. What he did was he took pigeons and he put them in this box. And there was a lever in that box. And with one group of pigeons, every time they pecked the lever, a piece of food came out. The other group of pigeons, when they pecked the lever, sometimes food would come out, sometimes it wouldn't. What he found was is that the pigeons who had the consistent reward, when the food stopped coming, they stopped pecking because they realized the good deal was over.
It's right now.
The pigeons who had the uncontrollable reward, when the food actually ended up stopped coming, they kept pecking and didn't stop. They pecked for over 250,000 times, like an
Wow.
unbelievable amount. So that same result was shown with humans after that. And the slot machine in casinos was designed
Mm-hmm.
around this idea. When you have an uncontrollable random award, you just get addicted. You don't stop. Social media companies like Facebook and Instagram, or Meta, I guess owns both of those now, they have capitalized this in a modern society where when you get a ding with a like or a friend request, it keeps you coming back for more, which means
Mm-hmm.
your eyes are on the screen and they get advertising dollars. But you can see the same thing happen with goal pursuit. If you put too much emphasis on the achievement, you're going to get that reward, But because, again, it depends, a lot of those goals depend on our external environment. When we put too much emphasis on that success, we get addicted to it. And so if it's work, you can get addicted to promotions or money or
Mm-hmm.
praise. If it's in your relationships, you can get addicted to the reinforcers you get from your partner, and you always need to find ways to feel that love. You can
Yeah.
get addicted to these things. Those things in themselves are not unhealthy, but when you put the emphasis on the goal achievement, you fall into that trap, and it can be really hard to get out of.
Ooh, that is a really, really, really interesting point. And I'm thinking back into my own life, how many times that it's like something becomes consistent and then you just kind of expect it, you know? But I also think that that expectation can be a positive thing. You know, I think of, you know, in business, for example, I've always been really grateful that business just kind of lands, you know, and I don't really have any which way about it of why exactly, you know, opportunities land exactly when they do. But when they do, I'm like, oh, yeah, that makes so much sense that it would happen that way, you
Yeah,
know? But I think it's a combination of showing up in your life in all of the different ways that serve you and the people around you in the best possible way. Would you
absolutely.
agree?
I would totally agree. And balancing, it's not like you should not care or not appreciate the goal achievement.
Mm-hmm.
That's called savoring, is the ability to just
Mm-hmm.
appreciate those good things. Savoring is a really important part of psychological health, but balancing that with, to your point, like showing up and doing the daily things, that brings us back to the idea of control. What
Mm-hmm.
can we control in our daily life? When you put the primary emphasis on showing up every day and what you can control, then it allows you to savor the results without being completely dominated by them. Because the day after the result, guess what? You show up again and you keep
Mm-hmm.
working, keep controlling. And that's just life. There is no reward during our lifetime that makes that cycle stop. You got
No.
to keep showing up. You got to keep pushing yourself. You got to keep trying to get better. And that's life, but it's a beautiful thing.
Exactly. And I think too, some people will look at that as like something that's empowering and exciting. And then other people will look at that and be like, oh my gosh, this is so exhausting. Like, when do I get my break? Like, when will it end?
Mm.
Right. What would you say to someone who might be in that mindset to help bring them back into this place of possibility and abundance and like that this is just the journey, that this is just,
Yeah.
it's flow?
Well, so you just said it. It's flow. And so I'm fascinated by the psychology of flow, and also with another psychological theory called deliberate practice.
Hmm.
So a lot of flow is a familiar thing, but it was actually coined by a psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi.
Hmm.
And what he found over the research of his life is that flow experiences are the happiest moments of a person's life. There's another guy, Anders Ericsson, and both of them just recently passed away. He was known as
Hmm.
the expert on experts. His research led to Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hour rule, if you're familiar with that, which
Yep.
says if you practice something enough and push yourself for 10,000 hours, then you master it. There's Erickson found some discrepancies with that, but that's for another podcast. But anyway, the point is Erickson and Csikszentmihalyi actually disagreed with each other, even though deliberate practice and flow look very, very similar. They both require a goal. They both require getting out of your comfort zone, breaking that goal into baby steps, and having immediate visual feedback of your success or failure.
Hmm.
The only difference between deliberate practice, which is about pushing yourself, and flow, which is about experiencing the moment, is that flow occurs at the very point where your skill meets a challenge. So it's where you're pushing yourself to the very limit, where deliberate practice occurs outside of that limit. When you've pushed yourself beyond what you're capable of, that
Hmm.
leads to failure, but failure leads to learning. Learning leads to new skill development. The interesting thing is they kind of pointed at each other and said, you're wrong because you feel like life is about pushing yourself. You're wrong because you feel like life is about enjoying the moment. I believe they're actually connected. By deliberately practicing what I refer to as your ideal, the version of yourself that you want to become,
Hmm.
pushing yourself out of your comfort zone consistently learning new skills, that's going to lead you to points where that skill meets the challenge. Now you get into flow. And
Hmm.
so flow can be in a really elusive thing, but I believe when you consistently push yourself, you experience more flow states. And
Hmm.
so to somebody who is struggling with, how to implement these ideas, try pushing yourself towards a consistent goal, but then realize when all of a sudden all of that pushing seems to just fade away. All of a sudden it feels like what you're doing takes 5 hours when it was only 5 minutes, or
Hmm.
felt like it was 5 minutes when it took 5 hours. realize that you just got the ultimate reward of flow, enjoy it, savor it, then show back up, keep working so you can get it again.
Beautiful. I love that. Mark, I would love to shift our conversation just a little bit. And I want you to talk about your book, your book that's already launched by the time this has gone out. And I want to know, a little bit about what people can learn when they read it. But what I want to know the most is, what is the one thing you hope someone gains from it when they're reading it?
Yeah, no, thank you. So actually it launched this week. It launched on the 20th of February.
Congratulations.
And we did so well that we broke Amazon. And so it's available on Prime. And by the time your listeners are listening to this, I hope it'll be fixed. But on the first day, blew through their entire inventory and we sold out. Yeah, luckily, so the book is published through Forbes Books, and
Mm-hmm.
luckily they had printed thousands of extra copies and they're being shipped over today as we speak. So the Prime
Incredible.
feature will be back up, but it kicked us off Prime. But the impact that it's already had on people has been just so rewarding for me
Mm-hmm.
personally. I'm savoring that right now.
Yeah.
And what I really, really am grateful for are the reviews that we're getting from people who are saying that the ideas in this book have helped them take back control of their stress.
Mm-hmm.
So the book itself, it's called The Ideal Life. The reason it's called that is because it's based on the framework that my company uses to teach people what deliberate practice is and how they can use it to achieve flow states. Deliberate flow is what we call that. The I Got This framework is an acronym which stands for the ideal and then goals, objectives, and tasks. So the ideal is where you start by identifying your ideal. It is something you can put down on paper that represents your purpose. It represents the vision of the person that you want to be over the course of your life. But rather than spend your whole life trying to identify your purpose and never coming up with it, because none of us can really know what that is,
Yeah.
it helps you put something on paper that is then useful. And how it's useful is you use that to then align long, medium, and short-term goals, that's the G of the framework, with these controllable actions we've talked about today. Objectives, which are the things you want to accomplish that you can control, the projects you're working on, and then the tasks, the habits you want to develop that extend past the goal achievement and help you become the type of person that you want to be on a daily basis. And so the book itself is not the step-by-step guide of how to actually do our I Got This framework. Each chapter uses those elements to talk about the psychology behind why they work, and then introduce practical tools and exercises that the reader can do to take advantage of those psychological ideas in their own life. So the one thing that I hope people get out of it really ties into what we've been talking about in this conversation, which is that stress is not something that you want to get rid of. I wrote this book and I started this company because of all the stress that I've dealt with in my life and the depression that it has slipped into at times. And what I've learned is that the best way for me to deal with that is through the realization that being intentional about your stress and applying it towards the pursuit of the type of person you want to become, that's where joy comes from. Trying to run away from your stress and escape it is not the answer. And so I hope that people can experience more joy in their life by learning how to harness that stress rather than run away from it.
That is so beautiful. Thank you. And I'll make sure that all of the links are in the notes below, including where they can connect with you, as well as a link to purchase your book. I have one more question for you. It's a question I've been asking on my show ever since I started this podcast, and I always get a different answer. I'm curious to know what yours is going to be. But what's one way my listener can create a little more happiness in their day, every day, starting today?
I've got a tool that people can use in their daily basis. It's called the Dose 180. It's what we refer to it. The dose is from the chemicals we've talked about, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. The 180 comes from another psychological theory called mental contrasting from Gabriel Oettingen. Mental contrasting comes from her findings that positive visualization just becomes daydreaming, which is not helpful, unless it's immediately followed by negative visualization. In other words, thinking about what challenges are you likely to face as you try to achieve what you're trying to achieve. When you follow positive visualization immediately by thinking about those challenges and a plan to overcome it, then positive visualization actually is one of the most powerful things that you can do. So it goes from being hurtful to really, really helpful. And so a dose 180 captures that by saying, okay, think about whether it's, you're about to go in front of a group of people and present and you have stage fright, or you're working on a long-term goal and you're, thinking about all the things you have to do. Think about that thing in front of you. Then the way I say it is turn to your left and think about just mentally and think about what success looks like. Think about how it feels to deliver that presentation without fear in a
Mhm.
perfect way where nobody is, you don't feel like anybody's judging you and you don't miss a beat and everything's perfect. Visualize that perfect image, but then turn to your right and think about, okay, now what's actually going to happen? My heart rate's going to increase. That's going to cause me to stammer. Well, what can I do about that? I can do a short breathing exercise, maybe. Just take 2 big breaths. Now, when you get into the situation, because you have visualized the positive outcome and thought about the challenges there, you're going to be better prepared for that moment. And
Mhm.
while you're not going to have the perfect delivery that you might visualize, you're going to get much closer to that than you would have. So we call
Mhm.
it a dose 180 because you're looking to the positive, and then you're doing a 180 and you're looking to the negative. And you can apply that on something very short in your day, or you can apply it to your long-term goals. It works just as well either way.
I love that. That is super cool. Thank you so much for being here today and for sharing everything that you shared. I'm super grateful for you and your time.
I'm grateful for you. Thank you so much. I look forward
Thank
to
you.
continuing to listen to your podcast.
Thanks. Thank you. Me too. Let me know what you think. And thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode on Happiness Happens. I hope you have a beautiful day ahead. Connect with us. Let us know what you love from our conversation. And remember that happiness happens when you're least expecting it.